The first time I realized the forest was listening to me, really listening, I was standing alone beneath a stand of old growth pines so tall they carved the sky into thin, trembling slices. The wind had stopped. The insects had stopped. Even the creek beside me had quieted itself, as if the entire world had paused mid-breath to hear what I might say next. And in that impossible, suspended silence, I felt something shift, inside the woods or inside me. I still don't know. But it marked the beginning of the stories I'm about to tell you. Stories that locals still whisper even when the sun's out, stories they warn newcomers about with a shake of the head and a look over the shoulder. Stories that carved a part of me away and replaced it with something colder, older, and infinitely less certain. My name is Caleb. I'm 42 years old, and I've spent more than half my life as a ranger assigned to the Northern Divide District. That stretch of forest covers more than 1 million acres of mountain, ravine, and pine thickets, so thick they swallow daylight whole. Out here, we get more stories than hikers. Missing hunters, strange prints in the snow, lights drifting through the understory at night, voices calling names no one's used in decades. We treat most of it as superstition or adrenaline-fueled imagination because that's how you stay sane. But there are some things you can't shake off, no matter how many reports you fill out about misidentified wildlife or natural explanations. I didn't start out afraid. Back then, I moved through the tree line with the confidence of someone who believed knowledge was the same thing as safety. I thought maps could protect me, that training could arm me, that the forest was something I could understand as long as I respected it. But the older rangers, those who'd spent 30, 40 years walking these slopes, watched me with this quiet sympathy. They knew what was coming for me long before I ever felt its breath against my neck. One of them, an old-timer named Harlan, took me aside during my first week. He was one of those men whose face carried the history of the land, scarred, creased, weathered by storms he wouldn't talk about. He didn't give advice often, didn't waste words. But I still remember the way he looked at me that day, his eyes half-shadowed under the brim of his hat. "There's 3 laws in these woods," he said, "and they ain't written on any sign. First, if you hear someone calling your name from deeper in the trees, don't answer. Second, if you see something run across the trail on all fours, but it's too big to be anything that should run on all fours, don't follow it. Third, if you find a cave that wasn't on your map yesterday, you walk away. I don't care if someone's screaming from inside, you walk away." I laughed a little because I didn't know any better, and he didn't laugh with me. "You think I'm joking," he said. "But I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to keep you alive long enough to learn what we're really dealing with." I didn't know what he meant. Not yet. I learned. The first story I'm going to share isn't the most violent or the most dramatic, but it's the one that cracked the armor I built around myself. The one that taught me how fear likes to start small, like a single cold fingertip resting against your spine. And once it finds the right spot, it presses. It happened during my second autumn season on the job. The forest turns oddly quiet in mid-October, too quiet. Animals move less. Even the wind seems reluctant to stir up the brittle needles. That year, we'd been dealing with a string of what we called false disappearances. Campers getting lost for a few hours and stumbling back out with stories that made no sense. People swore that trails looped in ways they shouldn't, that landmarks moved, that they heard footsteps behind them on empty ridgelines. The usual things that come from fatigue and nerves. But one report was different. It came from a hunter who wasn't the type to scare easy, a man named Marcus who'd been tracking mule deer since he was old enough to hold a rifle. He radioed in, sounding breathless, panicked, insisting something massive had stepped out behind him while he was quartering a buck. Said it wasn't a bear. Said it wasn't an elk. Said it wasn't anything he'd ever seen. Dispatch called me because I was closest. It was late afternoon when I reached the coordinates he gave, one of those remote pockets of the forest where the trees grow so tightly your shoulders brush branches on both sides of the trail. I found his pack, his knife, the half-finished job, blood soaking the pine needles. But I didn't find him. What I found instead was a smell. I remember that more than anything. A smell like wet stone and cold breath, as if the forest itself had exhaled straight from the lungs of winter. It didn't belong there, not in that mild autumn air. It pressed against my face the moment I stepped into the clearing, and the hairs on my arms rose instinctively. "Caleb?" I heard Marcus call. "Over here." His voice came from somewhere deeper in the trees, past a line of pines so black and close together they looked like a wall. Nothing about the direction made sense. It wasn't where his tracks went, and it wasn't the way he would have traveled. But I stepped toward it anyway. "Caleb, help me." It was weaker that time. Strained. Strangled. I took 3 steps toward that wall of trees, 3 steps into that cold, strange air. Then I heard another sound behind me. The distinct crack of a branch under a heavy footfall. I stopped breathing. Someone or something was standing behind me. I didn't turn around immediately. I couldn't. My body locked itself into stillness, instinct overriding everything I thought I knew. The forest went silent again, like it had the day I first felt it listening. My heartbeat was loud enough to echo in my skull. Another slow, deliberate footfall pressed into the ground. "Caleb," the voice called again from the trees, weaker, wrong, like someone trying the shape of my name for the first time. I understood then. The voice wasn't Marcus. I finally turned. Nothing stood behind me, but the ground told another story. Pine needles were crushed into massive, deep impressions, too elongated for a bear, too heavy for a man. Whatever made them had been right there, close enough to touch me. I didn't run. Not because I wasn't terrified, I was, but because every instinct screamed that movement would trigger whatever shared that clearing with me. So I backed away, slow, 1 step at a time. The voice kept calling. The footprints kept appearing behind me, one by one, as if something invisible stalked just out of sight. I didn't see Marcus until the next morning. A search team found him a mile downslope, sitting beneath a cedar, staring at nothing. His clothes were intact, his rifle was beside him, but his expression was hollow. He didn't remember calling for help, didn't remember seeing anything, didn't remember running. But when I asked him what scared him most, he whispered one thing. "I don't think it was trying to kill me," he said. "I think it was trying to learn me." I didn't know what that meant then. I would. I'd learn too. Just not in the way I expected. I didn't talk about that first encounter for a long time. Not to the other rangers. Not to the locals who loved trading stories over black coffee at the diner. Not even to myself in any way that felt honest. It sat inside me like a splinter under the skin, too small to justify digging for. Too deep to forget. But the forest has a way of returning lessons you refuse to learn the first time, and the next story came in colder, darker, and with a kind of patience that felt almost sentient. It was late winter when the second encounter happened. The cold that year rolled down the mountains in sheets sharp enough to cut through every layer I wore. The pines looked different in winter, more skeletal, more watchful. Their branches creaked in the wind like old joints remembering injuries. Snow softened every sound, pressed the world into a muted hush that made even my own breath feel too loud. That quiet should have been peaceful, but it wasn't. Not that year. Not after Marcus. I'd been assigned to check a series of seasonal cabins used by backcountry researchers, right? They weren't occupied during winter, but we had to make sure roofs hadn't collapsed, that bears hadn't clawed their way inside searching for food, that vandals hadn't discovered them. The cabins were spaced miles apart, connected by trails that narrowed into deer runs the deeper you went. It was isolated work, the kind of assignment that forced you to sit with your thoughts longer than most people find comfortable. By noon, I'd already checked 2 cabins. Both fine, both quiet, too quiet. Snow was falling harder, drifting in slow spirals, and the air carried that metallic taste that always precedes a storm. I remember thinking I should turn back early, just in case the weather closed in faster than predicted. But something kept pulling me forward, a heaviness in the air like the forest wanted me deeper. The third cabin sat beside a frozen lake, its wooden porch half buried in snow. As I approached, I noticed the usual things first. No broken windows, no tracks, no signs of intrusion, but something about the door pulled my attention. The wood was bowed outward very slightly, as though something had pressed against it from the inside. Not enough to break it, just enough to warp the grain. I scraped snow off the doorknob, turned it, and pushed the door open. The smell hit me instantly. Not rot, not mold, not human. It was a scent like cold iron, damp stone, and musk, all mixed together. Something that didn't belong inside a man-made structure. Something that belonged in caverns or deep, unbroken wilderness. I backed out quickly, pulling my sleeve over my nose. The cabin was freezing, shadow-drenched, and absolutely still. Then I saw the prints. They were faint, almost erased by wind drafting under the door, but still there. Huge, wide prints pressed into the thin layer of snow that had blown inside. They crossed the cabin floor and stopped at the table, then at the back wall, then at the table again, as if something had paced, waited, thought. I stepped inside only long enough to confirm what I feared. Those prints weren't from a bear, and they weren't from any human. Not unless a man could grow feet twice the size of mine and walk without disturbing the snow more than a whisper. I walked out and pulled the door shut behind me. Hard. That was when I saw it. A shape standing among the trees on the far side of the lake. At first, I didn't know if it was human. It stood too still, too tall. The falling snow blurred its silhouette, but not enough to hide its size. It must have been 7 feet, maybe more. The shoulders were massive, the limbs long. It looked like a man stripped of any softness or humanity, a rough outline cut straight from stone and shadow. I lifted my binoculars slowly, careful not to move too fast. The shape didn't react. Through the glass, the details sharpened, but only just. Snowflakes streaked across the lenses, distorting the image. What I saw was fur, thick and pale, a head hunched forward, arms hanging lower than they should, a torso that seemed to taper into legs bent slightly at the knees. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't an elk, and it wasn't, God, I wanted to believe this, any kind of myth whispered around campfires. But when it turned its head toward me, all belief and disbelief narrowed into one single truth. It had been waiting for me. The eyes were what froze me in place. They didn't glow, they didn't burn red or yellow. They were dark, reflective, depthless. Like caves, like entrances into somewhere you aren't meant to go. My breath escaped me in a burst of steam. The thing didn't move, didn't blink. It just watched me, as if deciding what to do next. Then very slowly it lifted its right arm. The hand, if you could call it that, was huge, broad, and tipped with fingers far too long. It raised the limb halfway, paused, and then extended one finger. It pointed at me. Only me. Through the falling snow. Across the frozen lake. As if marking something, as if remembering something, as if claiming something. A single heavy knock echoed from behind me. I spun around so fast my boot slipped in the snow. The knock came again, louder. It was from the cabin door. 3 slow knocks, spaced far apart, like someone testing the wood, like someone knocking with a fist large enough to warp the planks. But the cabin was empty. I turned back toward the lake. The figure was gone. I don't know how it moved so fast. A creature that size shouldn't have been able to slip away without shaking trees or shattering branches. But the forest was silent again. Cruelly, unnaturally silent. I backed away from the cabin, my eyes scanning the tree line, expecting the shape to reappear. But nothing moved. Nothing breathed. The lake sat untouched except for a single line of prints crossing its frozen surface, prints that hadn't been there before. They led straight toward me, straight toward the cabin, straight to where I was standing now. My legs almost gave out, but adrenaline dragged me forward. I turned and followed the trail back toward my snowmobile, my heartbeat thundering harder than the storm that had begun to swallow the sky. The forest pressed in tight, branches bending under the weight of new snow, the whole world turning white and gray and silent as bone. Halfway back, I heard it again, a knock. Not behind me this time, ahead of me, somewhere in the pines, then another, then a third. Slow, spaced, deliberate, like the forest itself had adopted the rhythm. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Knock to the left, knock to the right, knock behind me. Every time I tried to pinpoint it, the sound shifted, skittering between the trees like something moving just out of sight. The storm thickened until the air felt like wet cement. My clothes soaked through, my fingers numbed, but I kept going, because stopping meant listening, and listening meant acknowledging something I didn't have the courage to face. By the time I reached my snowmobile, the knocking had stopped. The storm swallowed every echo. I climbed on, started the engine, and didn't look back even once. I wouldn't have made it home if I had. When I returned to headquarters, frostbitten and shaking, Harlan met me at the door. He took one look at my face and didn't ask a single question. He just nodded, a grim understanding settling over him like snow on a branch. "So, you heard it too," he said quietly. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because deep in my bones, beneath the fear and the disbelief and the denial I clung to, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever lived in those woods had found me again. And this time it wasn't just learning me, it was following me. It's strange how the mind works when fear settles into it, how it reshapes the world quietly, subtly, like frost forming patterns on a window. After that winter, I started noticing things I'd never noticed before. The way the pines leaned slightly towards certain ridges, as if pulled by some unseen weight. The way snow softened not just sound but emotion, numbing everything except the one feeling that wouldn't go away. Something in those woods knew me now. And it was getting closer. I didn't tell anyone. Not for weeks. I threw myself into work, hoping routine would blur the edges of what I'd seen. I patrolled trails, repaired signs, checked campsites, enforced fire regulations, normal ranger things. But even during the most ordinary tasks, a piece of my mind stayed locked on the tree line, listening, wondering, counting the seconds between gusts of wind to see if the forest would fall silent again the way it had before. It always did. Just long enough to feel intentional. The next story didn't begin with a call from dispatch or a sighting on the ridge. It started with a boy, a teenager, maybe 15, who showed up at the visitor center one Saturday morning in early spring. He was thin, pale, eyes darting like a rabbit that had been chased too long. His clothes were clean, but his knuckles were scraped raw. When he approached my desk, he didn't look at me directly. He stared past me into the long window framing the pines. "Something out there keeps following me," he said, "and it knocks." My body went cold, not because of the words, but the way he said them. Like he was repeating a memory that wasn't entirely his. "What did it sound like?" I asked carefully. "3 knocks," he whispered. My throat tightened. I motioned for him to sit. He didn't. He kept glancing over his shoulder toward the door like he expected something to push it open at any moment. "What's your name?" I asked. He shook his head. "You don't want to tell me?" "It's not that," he said. He swallowed hard. "It's that I don't think it matters anymore." That was when I realized his pupils were dilated, his breathing shallow, his hands trembling. He wasn't just scared, he was unraveling. "Where did you last hear the knocking?" I asked. "Last night," he said. "Outside the cabin." "What cabin?" He hesitated, eyes flicking toward the tree line again. "It's not on your maps," he said. My skin crawled. I leaned in. "What do you mean?" It just appeared. One night. Me and my dad were camping west of Ridgewater Pass. I went to get water from the creek, and when I came back, there was a cabin where the ridge used to be. He blinked rapidly, like it grew out of the dark. His voice shook. Something knocked at the door while my dad was checking the path. 3 times. Slow. Real slow. "And your dad? He didn't come back," the boy whispered. The world around us seemed to narrow. I felt the walls of the visitor center shrink inward, leaving only me, the boy, and the creeping dread threading its way between us. We launched a search within the hour. Standard protocol. But nothing about the situation felt standard. The boy refused to go home, refused to return to the search area. He just sat inside the visitor center with a blanket around his shoulders, staring out the window, flinching whenever the wind rattled the door. I led one of the search teams myself. Ridgewater Pass was a long hike, steep and uneven, with dense pines pressing close from both sides. The higher we climbed, the more the forest tightened its grip on the air. Birds went quiet. Squirrels vanished. Even the breeze seemed to avoid certain pockets of the mountain. An hour in, we reached the campsite the boy described, tents flattened by wind, fire pit full of cold ash, gear scattered like it had been thrown around in a panic. But there was no cabin, just rock, trees, snow. Still, the boy hadn't lied, not entirely, because a little ways beyond the campsite, nestled between two boulders, we found footprints, huge ones, deep enough to punch through the frost and into the earth below. The same shape I'd seen in the snow near the lake. Long, wide steps spaced far apart. Whatever left them was heavy and fast. We followed them only for a short distance. You don't track a creature that size into terrain where the trees thicken and light struggles to find the ground. Not unless you're ready to never come back out. And I wasn't. None of us were. We radioed in, expanded the search farther down the slope. But we all knew. We weren't going to find the boy's father. Not alive. Not in any recognizable state. When I got back late that afternoon, the boy was still sitting by the window. His eyes snapped toward me the second I opened the door. "Did you hear it?" he asked. He wasn't asking about the storm or the wind or the forest shifting under its own weight. He meant the knocking. The 3 slow taps that followed people like a curse. No, I told him truthfully. He nodded, but his expression didn't change. He pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. Then he said something that has haunted me every day since. It doesn't knock for you first. It knocks for the one you're with. And when they go missing, it chooses someone else. And then it follows that person forever. My breath caught. I felt something deep and cold settle into me. "Who told you that?" I asked. The boy turned his head very slowly toward the window, toward the trees, toward the shadows between the trunks. "It did," he whispered. Thunder rolled in the distance. Or maybe it was something else. "You need to go home," I said, heart pounding hard enough to shake my voice. "We'll keep searching, but you need rest, food, warmth." He shook his head again. "It won't matter. Once it chooses you, it never stops." I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. I kept hearing his voice. Remembering the prints, the cabin that wasn't on any map, the shape across the frozen lake pointing at me with a long, heavy limb. Had it chosen me? The question dug into my ribs like a buried hook. A week later, I got my answer. I was off duty, cooking dinner at home, when something tapped against my back door. 3 knocks. Slow. Even. Exact. The sound punched the air out of my lungs. I froze, spatula still in hand, heart slamming so loud I could hear blood in my ears. I told myself it was a neighbor, a branch, a raccoon, anything. But raccoons don't knock. I walked to the door on legs that didn't feel like mine. The kitchen lights cast a narrow glow across the floor. My house was silent except for the soft click of the wall clock. I reached the door, and the knocking came a second time, 3 knuckles dragging across wood. No one was visible through the glass. The porch light flickered once like someone had brushed past it. The trees beyond the yard shifted in a way that didn't match the wind. Then something breathed against the door, long, low, humid, too warm for the cold night air. My vision blurred. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to grab the rifle behind the pantry door. But I didn't move. Couldn't move. When the breath faded, something else took its place. An exhale of cold. A scent like wet stone. The same scent from the cabin. The same scent from the footprints. The same scent from the lake. Then silence. Until a voice whispered my name. Not loud, not forceful, but too close. Inside the wood, inside the air, inside my head. I staggered back. The lights flickered. The house felt suddenly too small, too fragile. Whatever stood outside knew me, knew my name, knew exactly how the sound of it would break me open, and it whispered again. Just once more. Caleb. Then the night went still. My knees hit the floor. The world tilted. Fear rushed through me in a sickening wave, hot and cold at the same time, because now I understood something I hadn't before. I wasn't just being followed. I was being claimed. I didn't open the door that night. I didn't sleep either. I sat in a chair facing the porch with every light off, gripping the rifle across my lap while the moon climbed high enough to paint the yard in pale squares. The forest stood motionless beyond the edge of the grass. Not a single branch moved, not a single cricket chirped. Even the wind held its breath. When dawn finally came, it came slow, like the sun hesitated to rise over my house. Only when the first gray wash of morning light touched the pines did the forest begin to breathe again. Birds called, twigs cracked. The world woke up as if nothing had happened. But I knew something had. I spent the next few days walking around like a ghost, wearing my own skin. Every sound felt sharper. Every shadow felt too long. At work, I avoided windows. On patrol, I kept my back against rock faces or wide-open clearings where nothing could sneak up behind me. The other rangers noticed, of course. They weren't blind, but they didn't ask. Maybe they were afraid to know the answer. A week passed. Then 2. I started telling myself I'd imagined the whole thing. That fear had run wild and sculpted shadows into monsters. That stress had been the true stalker. That there was no creature knocking on my door at night, no unnatural breath fogging the glass, no cavern-eyed presence measuring the depth of my soul. I almost believed it. Until the night I found the cave. I wasn't supposed to be out that late. A hiker had gone missing around Elkjaw Ridge, a 30-something guy who thought solitude was a cure-all. When he didn't return, we launched a search. By sundown, we still hadn't found his camp or pack. The others headed back to the trucks to regroup with headlamps and thermal gear, but I stayed behind, scanning the slope with my flashlight, refusing to leave the ridge until I felt the line between responsibility and obsession draw tight around my ribs. Fog rolled in from the valley, thick and cold, smothering the moonlight. My beam cut only a few feet ahead as I climbed toward a cliffside I'd scanned 100 times. The boulders looked familiar, but something about the alignment felt wrong, as if the land had exhaled and rearranged itself slightly since the last time I'd walked it. Then I saw it, a dark opening between 2 stone slabs. A cave. My heart stopped. My flashlight trembled in my hand. There shouldn't have been a cave there. I knew every natural cavity along that ridge, mapped them, flagged them, checked them for denning animals, but this wasn't mapped. This wasn't flagged. This was new. Or worse, this was waiting. I stepped closer, though every nerve screamed at me to turn around. The air pouring from the cave was freezing, colder than the fog, colder than the night. It smelled like the inside of the cabin. Wet stone. Iron. Something old. I should have walked away. Harlan's warning echoed clear as a church bell in my mind. If you find a cave that wasn't there before, you walk away. But the missing hiker, what if he was inside? What if he'd stumbled in and fallen? What if he was unconscious, minutes from hypothermia? Responsibility won, or maybe curiosity did, or maybe something else guided my steps into that opening, something patient and ancient and hungry. I lifted my flashlight and stepped inside. The beam stretched across a narrow tunnel that bent sharply to the left. The stone walls were slick with moisture, though it hadn't rained in days. The floor sloped downward and my boots slipped slightly on the cold rock. The temperature dropped with each step until my breath fogged in front of me. I called the hiker's name. My voice bounced back warped, as if someone repeated it a beat too late. I called again, and the cave whispered the name back, but not in my voice. My skin prickled, my heart rate doubling in an instant. I took another step, slowly, carefully. That's when the knocking started. 3 slow knocks. Not on the stone walls, not behind me. From deeper inside the cave, it wasn't possible. The acoustics didn't match. The sound didn't echo like it should have in an enclosed space. It was as if the knocks existed outside of distance, closer than they sounded, farther than they felt. Then something moved in the dark. A shuffle, a drag, a heavy exhale pushing cold air across my face. I lowered the flashlight beam and my hand froze. Footprints, huge ones, pressed into the damp rock as though the stone had softened to receive them. They led deeper, much deeper. And then the beam caught something else. A handprint, high on the wall, massive, spread wide, fingers long enough to curl around my wrist 3 times. My stomach twisted. That was when I saw the hiker. He stood just beyond the bend, half in shadow, facing the wall. His clothes were intact, but he wasn't moving, not even breathing. For a moment, I thought he was dead, frozen upright like a statue of fear. I whispered his name. He didn't respond. I approached him slowly, each footstep echoing too loudly. When I reached him, I placed a hand on his shoulder. His skin was ice. He turned, not fully, just his head, too slowly, far too slowly. His eyes were open, but the pupils were blown wide, swallowing the color almost completely. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, after several seconds of horrible silence, he spoke. "It's learning you," he whispered. My blood iced over. He stepped forward suddenly, pressing his body against mine, his face inches from mine, his breath dry and cold like something long buried underground. "It already knows your name." I tried to pull him back toward the entrance. I tried to get him to move. But his legs buckled, and he collapsed to the ground like rope cut at the center. He didn't respond to my shaking, didn't blink, didn't fight when I dragged him out of the cave. Only when the night air touched him did he finally shudder back to life, gasping for breath as if surfacing from deep water. By the time we reached the trucks, he could barely speak, but he kept repeating one thing in a trembling whisper. "It's behind you. Not now, not in that moment." He meant always, forever. A shadow tied to my footsteps, a presence that had found a doorway into my name and stepped through it. We got him to the hospital. He survived, but something in him never came back. His family moved him out of state. They told the papers he suffered hypothermia and hallucinations, but I knew better. I returned to the ridge 2 days later with a full team. The cave was gone, not sealed, not collapsed, gone. Rock where the opening had been, solid, unbroken. The land pretending it had never opened its mouth in the first place. Harlan didn't say "I told you so." He didn't have to. For weeks afterward, I felt the forest watching me, the pines tilting slightly as if tracking my movement, the wind quieting when I stepped onto trails, shadows lingering between trees too long after sunset. Every night I expected to hear the knocks on my door again. Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. But the silence was worse, because silence meant it was choosing its moment. I don't know what this thing is. Yeti, spirit, ancient animal, something between worlds. None of the words fit. The locals call it many names. The pine shadow, the cold walker, the one who knocks. But the names don't matter. What matters is this. The forest remembers the ones it touches. And it touched me. I'm older now, wiser, more afraid than I once believed a ranger could be. But I still go back into those woods every day, because fear doesn't get the last say, because the people who come here deserve protection, because I can't let whatever follows me have free rein over the ones who don't know how to listen for its footsteps. If you ever find yourself deep in the pines of the Northern Divide, and the wind stops all at once, if a cabin appears where one shouldn't, if a cave breathes cold onto your skin, if you hear 3 slow knocks from somewhere you can't see, don't answer. Don't follow the sound. Don't speak your name out loud. And whatever you do, even if you feel watched, even if fear coils tight inside your ribs, don't run. The forest notices those who run. It remembers them, just like it remembers me, and just like it will remember you. The night the pines finally spoke my name was the night I stopped pretending the forest didn't remember everything we did inside it. I used to believe silence was neutral, that the woods were nothing more than trees, wind, and soil. But silence in a place like this isn't empty. It listens. And sometimes, if you stay long enough, it remembers you. My name is not important, at least not anymore. But I'm 39. And I've spent more than half my life working in the northern ranges of the Bitterroot National Forest. Out here, towns are small, roads are winding, and most people grow up knowing 2 truths. First, that the forest feeds you if you respect it. And second, that the forest can take you without warning. Locals don't exaggerate. They don't need to. Their stories aren't folklore. Their warnings carved slowly into the collective memory of a place that has watched too many people vanish between the pines. I didn't grow up here, But I came young enough to pretend I did. When I was 22, I left everything behind: college, the city, the slow suffocation of walls, and applied for seasonal trail crew. I thought I was choosing simplicity, a clean break, something honest. Instead, I stepped into a place far older and far more complicated than I could have understood. And the forest began teaching me lessons in the order it wanted, not the order I needed. Back then, I was confident in ways only inexperienced people can be. I had endurance, good instincts, and the kind of optimism that's rooted in fearlessness, not wisdom. But the locals here, the families who have lived under the shadow of these ridges for generations, carry a different kind of knowledge. They don't brag. They don't boast about tough nights in the backcountry or how many miles they've hiked. Instead, their stories are quieter, shorter, spoken like confessions to the land itself. There's old Evelyn, who runs the diner in town and keeps the blinds drawn tight after sunset. There's Martin, who never hikes without shiny tin bells on his pack and won't explain why to newcomers. And there's a trapper named Garth who swears he once saw a shape as big as an elk, but moving on two legs through the snow at dawn. People laugh it off when he's drunk, but they fall silent when he's sober. You learn quickly here that silence is its own kind of evidence. By the time I became a full-time ranger, I had heard enough strange accounts from enough level-headed locals to form a simple conclusion: something in these woods makes people doubt themselves. Whether that something is an animal, a spirit, or simply the forest's own personality, I still can't say. But I have stories, and the pines were there for all of them. One fall night years ago, I was called to check on a forgotten campsite several miles off the service road. The last thing dispatch told me before the radio crackled out was that hunters in the area had reported a repetitive knocking sound for 3 nights straight. At the time, I barely reacted. In the forest, knocking could be anything: a loose branch, a woodpecker, a shifting trunk, even distant gunfire echoing strangely. But the way the hunters described it, same rhythm, same volume, same location, it wasn't random. It was deliberate. I remember the air that night, cold enough to bite but not enough to numb. The moon was thin, barely a fingernail above the ridge, so the forest pressed in around my headlamp beam like a curtain pulled tight. Every crunch under my boots felt like it echoed too far, as if the trees were passing the sound between them. That was the first time I felt the forest press back. I reached the campsite just past 11. The fire ring was cold, tents collapsed, gear scattered the way it gets when someone leaves in a hurry. But that wasn't what made me stop. It was the smell: wet fur and soil, heavy, musky, and strangely warm. A scent I'd split into 2 categories later in my career, animal or not, but at that time, I couldn't place it at all. It didn't match elk or bear or mountain lion. It was deeper, older. I crouched beside the fire pit, swept my fingers along the ashes, and felt something strange. Heat, not burning or smoldering, but warmth, like someone had pressed a living palm into the coals only minutes before. But the campsite looked abandoned for at least a day, maybe longer. My breath came out shaky, even though I forced myself to stay calm. Darkness in the woods has a way of magnifying uncertainty. It takes a stray thought and turns it into something with teeth. Then came the knock. Clear, hollow, from somewhere deeper in the trees. 3 taps. Not fast, not slow, measured. I felt the sound more than I heard it, like it hit the center of my chest first. I froze, listening, the way a deer listens for the difference between wind and footsteps. The forest held perfectly still, waiting for me to react. I didn't move. Another knock. 3 taps again. This time closer. My first instinct was to rationalize it, maybe a branch hitting a trunk, maybe the wind, maybe a squirrel launching itself from a limb. But the air was still, and the pattern was too controlled. I shut off my headlamp for a moment, letting my vision adjust. The dark was thick enough to feel on my skin, brushing close, almost breathing. When I turned the headlamp back on, the beam caught something between the trees. A shape. Tall. Upright. But too still to be a person, too narrow to be an elk, too high off the ground to make sense. It didn't move, but I felt the sudden drop in my stomach, the way you feel when a loose stone shifts under your foot on a steep trail. It knew I saw it. The knocks came again, but this time not from the woods. They came from behind me. I spun so fast the headlamp beam fractured across the branches. Nothing was there, just empty forest. But the sound had been close, within feet. My mind tore in two directions. One part screaming danger, the other whispering denial. A good ranger learns to trust their instincts, but a young ranger trusts logic first, even when logic starts to feel flimsy. I settled my breath, tried to speak evenly. "Who's out there?" Nothing answered, not in words, at least. But I felt the forest breathe around me, a subtle shift in the air pressure, a movement I couldn't see but could sense in my bones. I walked the perimeter of the campsite slowly, shining the beam into every gap between trunks. My skin prickled with the feeling of being watched, not by one set of eyes, but by many. The hairs on the back of my neck lifted like they'd been brushed upward by a hand. Then, just when I convinced myself I was letting my imagination get the best of me, the scent returned. Wet, warm, animal, but wrong, like the forest exhaled something that didn't belong here. I stilled, and the thing between the trees stepped forward, not a full step, just enough to shift its weight, enough for the needles under its foot to whisper. But that sound alone told me it was heavy, bigger than me, maybe bigger than any person had a right to be. I gripped my radio. Static. I tried again. More static. When I finally forced myself to look up, the shape was gone, vanished without a sound. And the forest, relieved of its momentary stillness, released a long, low groan as the wind finally stirred. But the wind didn't comfort me. It felt like the forest sighing, the way an old man sighs when someone ignores a warning. I stayed until dawn, pacing, listening, every breath sharp and deliberate. And as the first thin blade of sunlight sliced across the pines, I noticed something I hadn't seen in the dark. Tracks. Huge ones. Not bear. Not elk. Not anything I recognized. Every instinct I'd ignored the night before suddenly surged up my spine, because the tracks didn't lead into the forest. They circled the campsite. All night, something walked around me, watching. And as the sun finally rose above the ridge, warming the frost on the needles, I understood something I wish I had learned much earlier. The forest does not always want to be understood. Sometimes it just wants to see how close you'll stand to the things that watch from between the trees. I didn't tell anyone the full truth about what happened that night. Not then. Not for years. It wasn't fear of ridicule. Rangers see enough strange things that you stop worrying about sounding odd. It was something different. Something quieter. Like the forest had placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "This is between us." So I kept it, but the tracks returned in my dreams. Every night for a month, each time they drew closer. Life as a ranger teaches you patterns of weather, wildlife, tourists, even your own reactions. I knew what fear felt like. I knew what stress felt like. But this was neither. This was intrusion. A slow unraveling of my certainty, pulled thread by thread every time I closed my eyes. I kept working, though, because the forest doesn't pause for your sanity. Trails need clearing. Lost hikers need finding. Fires need preventing. And sometimes you convince yourself that staying busy is the same thing as staying safe. The second story I carry, one the locals still whisper about when winter rolls in early, began on a cold December evening when the snow had just started sticking, not deep enough to slow you down, but deep enough to hold a print. I was on patrol near the old mining caves, relics from a century back when the mountains were carved open for whatever silver or copper could be scraped out before the land reclaimed itself. Most of the caves had collapsed or been sealed, but some remained, narrow, dangerous, cold as grave soil. Locals treat those caves like open wounds. They don't go near them unless they have to. The call came in at 4:17 p.m., a father and his teenage daughter overdue from a day hike. They were experienced, well-prepared, or familiar with the trails. That alone raised the alarm. Mistakes happen, but they usually happen to the unprepared. When seasoned hikers vanish, you feel something deeper twist in your gut. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sky had darkened into a bruised purple. Snow drifted lazily through my headlamp beam as I followed the father's boot prints, steady at first, then staggered. The daughter's footprints were lighter, smaller, close behind his. Something was off, but I didn't know what yet. The prints led toward the largest of the old mine openings, a place the locals refer to with an uneasiness that isn't quite fear, but isn't far from it. When I was new here, I asked why they avoided it. I expected to hear about cave-ins or wildlife dens. Instead, I got a single sentence from old Evelyn spoken without a hint of exaggeration. Because some places remember what we bury in them. I thought she meant memories, stories, history. But standing there in the dark, fresh snow settling into the father's footprints leading straight to that yawning black mouth in the rock, I heard her words differently. I stepped inside. Cold swallowed me instantly, sharp and intimate, like stepping into the lungs of the mountain itself. My breath echoed faintly, too faintly. Sound should bounce in a cave, but mine felt muffled, absorbed by something unseen. I called out, not loudly, just enough to test the space. No echo, just silence, heavy, expectant. The footprints continued deeper, weaving slightly as if the father had been disoriented. No blood, no sign of a struggle, no drag marks, just footsteps that drifted like someone being guided by something they could hear, and I couldn't. 20 yards in, I heard the first sound. A drip. Water, I thought. Another drip, except it wasn't water. It was too rhythmic, too intentional. Each drop, if you could call it that, hit with the same soft tap, like something tapping stone with a thick fingertip. Tap, tap, tap. I swept my light across the cave walls. Nothing. The prints continued ahead, slow and hesitant now I followed, my pulse thudding through my gloves. Tap. Behind me this time, I spun, shining the light hard, only my own prints leading back out. No one else. But the sound, whatever it was, had moved. Echoes don't shift like that. They don't circle you. The tapping came again, this time above me, soft enough to feel more than hear. A vibration through the stone. The kind of sound an animal might make if it crawled across the ceiling on hands too large to belong to anything native to these mountains. I breathed through the rising panic. You're a ranger. You handle situations. You don't lose control. But reason felt thin in that cave, stretched like a thread pulled too tight. The footprints eventually stopped at a narrow pinch point where the cave split in two directions. To the left, footprints continued, just the daughter's, light, straight, as if she walked with purpose. To the right, a single boot print from the father pressed deep, and then nothing. No return, no scuff marks, no retreat. Like he stepped forward and was simply gone. I felt an instinct rise. Turn left, follow the girl. But another feeling, colder and older, whispered from the stone. You're not alone, I heard breathing then. Slow, heavy, not human. It came from everywhere at once, saturating the air like humidity in summer. My light jittered in my hand as I forced myself to stay rooted. And then the smell reached me. The same one from the abandoned campsite. Wet fur, soil, heat. But saturated now. More primal. As if whatever owned that scent lived here, deep inside the rock, and its presence had soaked into every crack. The tapping started again. Closer, right beside my ear. I stepped back so fast, my boot slipped on loose gravel. My shoulder hit the wall. I braced myself, one hand on the cave, one clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. A whisper threaded through the cold air. Not a word, not a language, but a sound shaped like intent. It came from the right tunnel. And so did a shift of air, just a stir, but warm. Something alive had moved there recently, something big enough to alter the draft. My radio crackled suddenly, loud in the cramped space. We've got the girl. She made it out to the trailhead. She's hypothermic but alive. Where are you? I exhaled hard. Relief punched through me, sharp and overwhelming. But before I could respond, the girl's voice, weak shaking, leaked through the speaker. Don't go deeper. Don't follow him. Please. Her plea wasn't confused. It wasn't delirious. It was terrified. Terrified in a way that wrapped its fingers around my spine. I looked down the right tunnel again. My headlamp beam reached only a few yards before the dark swallowed it whole. The tapping answered from somewhere inside. Soft. Patient. welcoming. I stepped back. Something moved in the darkness then, just enough for the beam to catch the faint sheen of fur. Tall. Too tall. But what broke me wasn't its height. It was the shape of the shoulders, broad, sloping, and the way the head lowered slightly when the light touched it, not recoiling like a bear or lunging like a predator, but lowering as if recognizing me, as if waiting. I turned and moved, not running. Running invites chase, but moving with a steady, deliberate urgency that felt like holding your breath underwater and swimming toward the surface before your lungs burst. Behind me, the tapping grew faster. Not angry, not hunting, calling. When I finally reached the cave entrance and the night air hit my face, I didn't stop. I walked until the cold wind sliced through the panic sweating beneath my jacket. Only when I saw the rescue team's lights did I allow myself to breathe fully. The father was never found. Not a piece of clothing, not a scrap of gear, not a single boot print beyond the one in that tunnel. The daughter said he heard something inside the cave, something she couldn't hear, and walked toward it as if pulled by an invisible thread. When she tried to grab him, he whispered a single sentence, "I think it knows me." I didn't sleep for days afterward, not because of what I saw, but because of what I felt when it lowered its head in the light. Recognition. Like whatever lived in that cave had been waiting for someone exactly like me. Maybe waiting for me. I wish that story had been the last. But the forest doesn't work that way. It never gives you one warning. It gives you 3. And the third one is the one that changes everything. The third warning came in the deep part of winter, the part where the sky stays gray for days and the forest feels suspended between breaths. Snow fell that week in a slow, relentless curtain, burying trail markers, muting sound, and turning the entire Bitterroot Range into a white labyrinth. Most rangers dread that kind of weather, not for the cold or the danger, but for the strange quiet that settles over everything. It's the kind of quiet that feels aware, like the forest is listening more closely than usual. By then, months had passed since the cave incident. I had convinced myself, not fully, but enough, that whatever I saw in that tunnel belonged to the past, a single moment, a single mistake, and that the forest had decided to let me walk away. But the forest never forgets. I was on patrol near the Upper Ridge Cabins, old ranger stations built in the 1950s and rarely used now except during avalanche season. Snow was falling thick, the kind that clings to your eyelashes and muffles your footsteps. The air tasted metallic, like freezing rain was waiting just beyond the clouds. I checked the cabins one by one, locked, empty, undisturbed. Nothing unusual. Not until I reached cabin 16. The door was closed. It should have been locked. But the snow told the truth. There were tracks outside. Not boot prints. Not animal prints. Something else. The depressions in the snow were wide and deep, shaped vaguely like feet, but too long, too flat, and placed too far apart. Each print was nearly 2 feet from heel to toe, and the stride length was impossible, well over 5 feet between steps, like whatever made them didn't move the way people or animals do. I crouched low, brushing snow from the nearest print. The edges hadn't frozen over. Whatever had been here passed through minutes earlier. A faint warmth clung to the imprint, the same wrong warmth I'd felt at the campsite years earlier. My breath caught, white fog curling through the air. I reached instinctively for the radio, but hesitated. What would I say? I found prints big enough to belong to a nightmare. Something non-human is roaming near the ridge cabins. Logic wants shape and classification. Fear wants movement and escape. But instinct, true instinct, just wants survival. The door to cabin 16 hung slightly open, cracked just enough for a thin rope of darkness to leak through. I should have called for backup. I should have waited. Instead, slowly I stepped closer. The wood creaked beneath my boots, a subtle warning swallowed by the thick snow. The wind picked up briefly, sighing against the roof, and for a moment I heard something else beneath it, something like low breathing coming from inside. Not rushed, not panicked, steady, patient. I pushed the door open. The cabin was dark, colder inside than outside. My flashlight beam swept across the interior, an old cot, a broken stove, a wooden table scarred with initials, everything coated with dust and abandonment. Then the smell hit. Warm, musky, wet earth, fur. My vision swam for a second, the scent dredging up memories I had tried to bury, the campsite, the cave, the moment my headlamp touched fur in the darkness, and something lowered its head as if greeting me. I stepped back into the doorway, pulse hammering, fighting the urge to flee. That's when the sound came. Not tapping, not footsteps. A low rumble, like a growl pressed through a human throat. It vibrated inside my chest, not loud but deep, like something massive shifting its weight. The rumble faded, replaced by a soft, dragging sound, something heavy scraping across wood. Then stillness, thick, expectant. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, sweeping the beam toward the far wall. The beam froze on a smear of dark brown across the floor. Not blood, mud, mixed with hair, coarse, thick strands the color of dead pine needles. My breathing quickened as the truth settled like ice under my skin. Something had entered the cabin. Something had stood inside, being wet snow and mud. Something had waited in the dark. I wasn't alone. The silence grew sharper, pressing inward like a tightening ring. I stepped back again, lifting the flashlight higher. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Inside the cabin. Not quite a voice, not quite wind. More like a shape of sound curled around the syllables of my name. The same way the pines whispered it that first night. A second whisper followed. Closer, lower, almost gentle. My skin prickled from scalp to wrist. Instinct screamed, "That's not mimicry. That's knowledge." I turned and stepped quickly into the snow, heart thundering, forcing my breath to stay steady. I walked away from the cabin without looking back, knowing that anything bold enough to enter a man-made structure was bold enough to watch from behind the cracked door. The forest didn't stir, no branches snapped, no movement trailed me. But something followed. Not in noise, not in sight, in presence. A heaviness pacing just beside the edge of my awareness, like a shadow walking parallel through the trees. It stayed with me for the entire hike back. Never closer, never farther. Sometimes the presence swelled, pressing against my ribs in a way that made every footstep stiffen. Other times it faded, but never fully. Never gone. At the trailhead, the presence stopped, snapped away in an instant like a hand lifting off my shoulder. I stood motionless in the falling snow, breath shaking, trying to understand the pattern. 3 warnings, 3 encounters. 3 times it could have taken me, but didn't. Was that mercy? Curiosity? Or something worse? Patience. That night I sat in my cabin with the lights off, listening to the storm claw against the windows. My stove cracked and hissed as it warmed the room. The logs popped. The wind pressed against the walls with long, groaning pushes. And beneath all of it, faint but unmistakable, I heard something else. Not from outside, from memory. A whisper that felt stitched into my bones now. I think it knows me. The father had said it in the cave. The girl had begged me not to follow. And whatever stood in the cabin, it didn't act like a creature encountering a stranger. It acted like something that had finally found what it had been searching for. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faint outline in the cave, the tracks around the campsite, the lowered head as if in recognition, as if it understood me better than I understood myself. By dawn, a truth I had avoided for years finally rooted itself inside me. It hadn't stalked those places by accident. It was following a pattern. My pattern. Every place it appeared was a place I'd been assigned to. Every encounter was personal. Every approach was deliberate. The forest wasn't warning me, it was calling me back, and I was running out of excuses not to listen. I didn't answer that call right away. Not consciously, not willingly. But once the idea rooted itself that something in the forest had singled me out, everything I did seemed to move me closer to the truth, not farther from it. Days blurred. Patrols carried a new weight. Every shadow felt purposeful. Every wind shift felt directional. And everywhere I went, I caught faint reminders of that same presence, subtle, deliberate, patient. I told myself it was paranoia, sleep deprivation, a mind shaped by fear instead of reason. You can explain anything if you try hard enough. Humans are experts at rationalizing what terrifies them. But that winter, the forest changed in ways I couldn't explain away. Tracks appeared near places I'd visited just hours before, huge, familiar, spaced impossibly apart. Snow on branches trembled in perfect intervals when the wind was still, like invisible fingers brushing each limb. The air carried that scent, wet fur, warm soil, raw earth, far more often than it should have. Animals moved differently too. Deer clustered together even in open fields. Coyotes kept their distance from the ridge trails they once roamed freely, and the elk, usually loud and territorial, went silent entirely. Not absent. Silent. You could see their shapes in the trees, frozen between trunks, watching something far deeper than my flashlight beam. Something had awakened, and every living thing felt it. One morning, I went to check a missing person report at a remote trail spur, an older hiker overdue by a full day. I expected the usual, a wrong turn, a twisted ankle, maybe a collapsed snow bridge. But as soon as I stepped into that valley, a sinking realization washed over me. The forest was too still. Birds didn't call, branches didn't shift. Even the air felt thick, like breathing through cloth. I followed the trail for 2 miles before finding anything unusual. Boot prints, just one set. But what stopped me cold wasn't the direction they headed. It was the path they took. They ran parallel to the trail for a long time, never drifting, never staggering, as if the hiker walked beside the official path but refused to step onto it. And then the prints veered sharply left and marched straight into the densest part of the forest, a place without clearings, without reason, without any trail at all. Something had drawn him there. I followed cautiously. The pines closed in overhead, branches thick with snow. My breath came out in thin clouds, dissolving too quickly. The tracks continued deeper until they reached a small circular clearing I had never seen before. That should have been impossible. I'd mapped this region. I knew its contours, ridges, runoff channels. There was no clearing here, but one existed now. And in the center of it lay the missing hiker's backpack, upright as if carefully placed. My boots crunched softly as I stepped closer. The pack wasn't torn or dragged, just set down. Snow around it was undisturbed, smooth like untouched icing. No footprints leaving the clearing, just the ones coming in. I knelt and brushed the top of the pack. Warm, not body warm, but heat warm, as if something with temperature had been near it moments before. A whisper of movement stirred to my left. I rose slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Then another whisper. Longer, more deliberate. Not movement. Not voice. Breathing. Heavy. Slow. Familiar. My heart climbed into my throat. I turned in a slow arc, light cutting between trunks. Snowflakes drifted lazily across the beam. The breathing didn't come from one direction. It came from all around, that pressing gently from every angle. A circle. Watching me from the trees, the same way the prince had circled the campsite years earlier. Something rustled the branches opposite me. Just a small motion, but enough for snow to slide off in a sheet. I stepped back, pulse hammering. Then I saw it. Not fully. Just a silhouette, a towering figure between the pines, broad shoulders brushing needles, head tilted down like before. Still. Too still. I whispered into the radio, my voice thin. Found the pack, need backup, possible large animal encounter. The radio hissed static at me. No response. The figure didn't move. But something about the way it existed, half light, half dark, felt intentional, like a predator testing the boundary of fear. My breath quickened. My vision tunneled. The forest held its breath with me. When I finally forced myself to take a step back, the figure shifted, one long, fluid motion, stepping deeper behind the trees. Not retreating, guiding. I understood the message immediately, even if I hated myself for it. Follow. I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I grabbed the pack, slung it over my shoulder, and began pacing backward toward the trail, keeping the light fixed on the gap in the trees where the figure had vanished. The breathing followed, a low, rolling exhale. Not threatening, not hunting, accompanying. The presence walked parallel to me the entire return trek, always just to my left, always just beyond the edge of sight. Sometimes I caught a flicker of movement, dark fur against white snow. Sometimes I felt the shift of cold air as something massive brushed against branches. But it never closed the distance. It simply stayed beside me, matching my pace. When I reached the trailhead and the official vehicles came into view, the presence halted instantly. The forest around me loosened, as if exhaling a long-held breath. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I knew it was still watching from between the pines. The hiker was never found, just like the father in the cave. Just like so many others the locals talk about with their eyes fixed on the floor, voices hushed, and something in me snapped, not fear, not panic, but understanding. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't misinterpretation. This was contact. Gradual, measured, deliberate. Over time, the presence had shaped itself around my life, around my patrol routes. Around my silence, it never harmed me, never chased me, never revealed itself fully. It wanted something else: acknowledgement, recognition, response. And deep down, buried beneath years of discipline, training, logic, I felt something growing. A pull, not attraction, not curiosity, obligation. The forest had extended a hand the first night I heard the knocking, and I had mistaken it for threat. It revealed itself in the cave, and I fled. It stood inside cabin 16, breathing inches from the darkness where I stood, and I ran again. But every time, it let me go. Not because it couldn't catch me, because it didn't want to. Not yet. That truth kept me awake more nights than I'd ever admit. Sometimes I'd lie in bed, eyes on the ceiling, listening to the wind drag its fingers across the siding. Sometimes I'd hear soft thumps, snow falling from branches, I'd tell myself. And sometimes when the night was especially dark and the world felt thinner, I'd swear I heard my name again, not from outside, from memory, from the cave, from the cabin, from the clearing, from something that had grown patient watching me fail to understand. I began avoiding the places where it appeared. I rerouted patrols. I filed unnecessary reports so other rangers would take my assignments. But the forest felt smaller every time I tried to escape it, like it was shrinking around me, like every tree had already decided where this was going. The strangest part wasn't the fear, it was the familiarity. A sense, deep, ancestral, that whatever lived out there had known me long before I knew myself. Like a story I'd heard as a child but forgotten, waiting for the right moment to return. A legacy whispered through pines older than my family name. A truth buried in the cave I refused to enter again. And I knew, with a clarity colder than the winter wind, that I couldn't keep avoiding it. The forest wasn't calling me. It was summoning me, and the cost of ignoring it was growing with every breath I took. I didn't decide to face it. The decision wasn't mine. Some paths unfold beneath your feet without your agreement, like the ground already knows where you have to go long before you take the first step. The forest had been drawing a circle around my life for years, closing it tighter with every encounter, every whisper, every track pressed deliberately into snow or soil. Avoidance wasn't working. It only made the forest more insistent. It finally happened during a late winter thaw, a strange, temporary warmth that slid through the mountains like a pulse. Snow melted off the branches in long, cold ribbons. Water dripped everywhere, steady and slow, like the forest was sweating. I was doing a routine check of the lower ridges when I found something unusual. A new trail. Not a man-made one. An animal trail, wide, pressed deep into old snow, leading uphill in a direction nothing heavy should have traveled. The forest had been silent that morning. Unnervingly so. Even the thaw seemed muffled, like sound was being swallowed by the trees. I knew better. Silence meant presence. I followed the trail partly out of curiosity, partly out of dread, but mostly because something in my bones told me I needed to. The tracks were massive, bigger than any I'd seen, bigger than the ones around the campsite or the clearing. They had weight, purpose, and the longer I followed them, the more a familiar warmth pulsed through the air, faint but unmistakable. It was nearby, closer than ever. The trail led to an area I knew well, a valley that sloped gradually into the canyon where the old mine tunnels ran beneath the mountain. I felt my chest tighten. The caves, of course. We always return to the places we're afraid of. Before I reached the entrance, I heard something that stopped me cold. Knocking. Not faint, not distant. Close. The same rhythm as years before. 3 measured taps, but heavier now. Stronger. Like fists wrapped in stone. Tap. 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 I froze beside a pine trunk, breath shallow. The knocks echoed, not just through the air, but through the earth itself, vibrating faintly under my boots. The sound wasn't coming from the cave this time. It was coming from the trees. A second set answered in the distance. Tap, 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 then another, even farther off. It wasn't one creature. There were more. A slow, creeping dread rolled over me, deeper than anything I'd ever felt. Fear isn't always sudden. Sometimes it rises like a tide, inch by inch, until you realize you're already submerged. I pressed my back to the tree, forcing myself to stay calm, but the knocking continued, steady and deliberate, like a signal echoing from trunk to trunk. I listened with everything I had, and then the forest exhaled one long, collective breath, and every knocking sound stopped at once. Silence dropped like a curtain. Footsteps followed. Heavy ones. Stepping toward me. I didn't run. I couldn't. My legs felt rooted to the ground, nerves locked between instinct and surrender. The footsteps were deliberate, each one sinking deep into the thawing snow, sending tremors through the soil. Then the breathing started. Not behind me. Not around me. Above me. The pine tree shuddered, bark cracking softly as something massive shifted its weight among the highest branches. Snow fell in chunks. I looked up slowly, flashlight beam shaking. At first, I saw nothing. Then the branches parted. Yellow eyes stared down through the needles, not glowing, not supernatural, but reflective, like a predator's eyes catching light in the dark. They blinked once, slow, heavy lids sliding across irises too large for any natural creature. The head lowered slightly, just like in the cave. Recognition. Acknowledgement. Invitation. My breath collapsed in my throat. The creature, whatever it was, descended the tree with a silence that defied its size. Its weight didn't snap branches or crack limbs. It moved like shadows move, shifting from shape to shape without disturbing the space between them. I stepped back, not running, retreating. It stopped 10 feet away, close enough to see breath pushing softly from its nostrils, close enough to see the hair, thick, dark, coarse, matted with snow and soil, close enough to see the shoulders, massive and sloped, rising and falling with slow breaths. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a moose, it wasn't anything I could rationalize. But the worst part wasn't what it looked like. It was what it felt like, familiar, like stepping into a memory too old to name. I raised my hand, not in defense, not in fear, but in instinct. Something inside me, older than logic, older than training, older than any ranger manual I'd ever memorized, reached outward, and the creature leaned forward slightly, its towering form shifting with a soft groan of muscle. Not threatening, not curious, confirming, as if proving that the thing I'd been denying all these years was the very thing I'd been running toward. My radio crackled then, loud, sharp, shattering the moment. Base to Ranger, do you copy? We've got a situation. The creature flinched, not from fear, from annoyance, like the voice broke an unspoken rule of the forest. I stepped back again, its head lifted, shoulders straightened, and then, with a motion so smooth I barely caught it, the creature turned and walked toward the cave entrance, slowly, deliberately, never looking back, expecting me to follow. I should have stayed put. I should have called for backup. I should have done anything except what I did. But the forest had been pulling me to this moment for years. And so with my breath shaking and my hands trembling, I followed. The creature moved into the darkness, disappearing into the cave's yawning mouth. I stepped inside seconds later, immediately swallowed by cold so deep it felt alive. The creature's footsteps echoed faintly ahead, not dragging, not lumbering, paced, measured, as if guiding me. The cave grew narrower, twisting deeper into the mountain. Moisture dripped from the ceiling. My flashlight flickered once, twice before steadying. The air smelled like earth and stone and fur, stronger now, concentrated, heavy. The deeper I walked, the more the cave felt familiar. Not from memory, from something older, an instinct I didn't understand. Then I reached the chamber, A wide, circular space carved by time or something else. The walls shimmered faintly with mineral veins. The air was warm, too warm. The creature stood near the far wall, its massive frame half illuminated in my beam, but it wasn't alone. Shapes moved in the darkness. Slow, silent, towering. Not threats, not predators. Witnesses. My pulse pounded in my ears. My knees nearly gave out. Every part of my mind screamed run, but something deeper, something with roots older than thought, kept me still. The first creature stepped forward, lowering its head, not in submission, not in dominance, but in acknowledgement. Recognition. Acceptance. I swallowed hard, breath trembling. For years I thought the forest was hunting me. But standing there in the warm breath of something ancient, surrounded by shapes larger than any creature I had ever known, I realized something far worse. It had been waiting for me, preparing me, calling me back to the place where my fear began, because fear wasn't the destination. It was the doorway, and I had finally stepped through. The chamber wasn't dead quiet, not anymore. Once my eyes adjusted, I realized the air carried a subtle vibration, a low, near imperceptible hum, so deeply woven into the stone that it seemed to come from the mountain's bones, not the creatures standing within it. The shapes stepped forward slowly, emerging into the faint halo of my flashlight. Broad shoulders, thick limbs, tall, taller than the first one, even. But it wasn't their height that froze my lungs. It was their presence. They didn't crowd me or threaten me. Instead, they formed a loose semicircle around the chamber edges, watching with stillness so complete it felt ceremonial. Their eyes reflected dim light like polished amber. Their breaths puffed into the air in slow, calm waves. This wasn't an ambush. This was an audience. The first creature, the one I'd followed, turned its head toward them. Not speaking, not signaling in any way I recognized, yet the others responded subtly. One lowered its head, another shifted its weight. I had the unmistakable sense of communication happening in a language older than words. Then the humming deepened. Not louder, lower. And it wasn't coming from the creatures, it was coming from the walls. The chamber vibrated gently beneath my boots, like the mountain itself was exhaling after a long-held breath. The hair on my arms rose. My instincts screamed to run, but fear had already passed into something different, something more overwhelming. A sense of being seen, not watched, seen, stripped of pretense, laid bare, measured, and yet not judged. The first creature stepped closer to me, not aggressively, not cautiously, purposefully. Its massive form blocked the tunnel behind it. As it approached, the heat radiating from its body washed over me, thick, musky, earthy, overwhelming, and strangely grounding. It reached out one massive hand, not to grab me, not to restrain me, to offer something. In its palm lay a stone, smooth, round, dark, about the size of a river rock. Nothing special at first glance until I realized something impossible. It was warm, warmer than the creature's hand, warmer than anything in that cave had any right to be. I didn't take it. My hand hovered, trembling. My mind spun with questions. Was it a tool, a symbol, a warning, a demand? I didn't dare touch it, yet I couldn't force myself to step back. The creature lowered the stone slightly, urging without forcing. A quiet invitation. Behind it, the others stepped in closer, not crowding but reinforcing the moment, like witnesses to a rite, or protectors making sure I understood the gravity of what was being offered. My throat tightened. This wasn't a confrontation, it was a choosing, and not mine. The creature leaned forward slightly, its breath washed over me, warm, earthy, strangely steadying. It made a low sound then, just once. Not a growl, not a moan, a rumble, like distant thunder rolling under the ground. And my hand moved before my fear could stop it. I touched the stone. Instantly, warmth surged through my fingertips, pulsing up my arm like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. My vision shimmered. The chamber blurred. The humming deepened into something between sound and memory. I staggered. The creature steadied me with one massive hand against my shoulder. Gentle, careful, controlled strength. When my vision cleared, the stone had dimmed slightly, as if its heat had transferred into me. The creature released me, then stepped back. The others lowered their heads in unison, and something inside me cracked open. Memories, not mine, rushed in. Flashes. A mountainside shrouded in mist. A hunter stalking through the pines centuries ago. A child lost in winter, wrapped in fur not made by human hands. A creature, this creature, standing watch over a campfire as snow fell silent and deep. Warnings given, warnings ignored. Territory respected, territory violated. A balance held, a balance threatened. Images came too quickly to grasp, too primal to translate. But the feeling behind them, the message, was unmistakable. We were never alone here, not for a moment. These beings had lived in the land long before parks or borders or ranger stations. They weren't ghosts or myths. They were guardians, watchers, keepers of a balance humans barely remembered existed. And something in the forest had shifted. Something was out of place. The stone warmed again in my palm, pulsing once like a heartbeat. The creature stepped back, the moment complete. Then, with a final glance toward me, it turned and walked to the edge of the chamber where a narrow passage disappeared into darkness. The others followed, one by one, massive silhouettes vanishing silently into the old tunnel like shadows retreating at dawn. But the last one, smaller or maybe just younger, paused. Its head tilted in a way almost human, and for a single second, a feeling rippled through me. Sympathy. Not for me. For what I would now carry. It turned and slipped into the dark. And then I was alone. The humming faded. The warmth in the air slowly dissipated. The chamber felt colder, emptier, suddenly immense. Only the stone in my hand still held heat, a soft radiance that felt like a living thing. I stared at it, breath fogging the air. Why me? Why now? Why this? I didn't get answers, just responsibility. The hike back through the tunnel felt twice as long. My flashlight flickered, my breaths echoed too loudly, and yet I wasn't afraid. Not the way I'd always been afraid in the forest, with that survival-tinged adrenaline. This was different. This was awareness. This was inheritance. When I stepped outside, the forest greeted me with a gust of cold mountain wind that carried the scent of thawing earth. The silence felt different now, not empty, listening, waiting. The sky had shifted to late afternoon. Clouds thickened overhead. The pines swayed as if stirred by something deeper than wind, and I realized something quietly devastating. I'd spent my whole career trying to protect people from what lived in these woods, but I had barely understood what lived here at all. The world didn't tilt under my feet. Reality didn't break. There was no dramatic revelation or monstrous chase. Just an understanding settling into my bones like winter cold. There were guardians in these mountains, ancient ones, powerful ones, hidden ones, and they had chosen me, not because I was brave, not because I was worthy, but because I had already been walking toward them my entire life without realizing it. The stone in my palm pulsed again, a reminder, a warning, a promise. I walked back toward Ranger Station as evening shadows lengthened across the valley. My radio crackled with missed calls, voices from base, a dozen normal problems demanding attention, lost hikers, a trapped elk, a storm warning. Life went on. People would camp, travel, get lost, return home. Most would never know the forest had eyes older than humans watching from the darkness. But I knew, and that knowledge did something unexpected. It steadied me. For the first time, I didn't walk the trails as a protector standing against unknown dangers. I walked them as someone in the middle of a vast, ancient agreement, one that existed long before rangers or cities or stories whispered around campfires. The forest wasn't my enemy. It wasn't my responsibility. It was my witness, and I was its witness in return. Those beings weren't monsters. They weren't myths. They weren't the vengeful spirits in the stories locals whispered at bars. They were reminders of how fragile we are, how small, how temporary, and yet how deeply we belong to the land we pretend to control. When I reached the station porch, I paused. The wind rustled through the pines. For a moment, the branches knocked together 3 times. Soft, rhythmic, unmistakably deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Not a warning, not a threat, an acknowledgement. I closed my fingers gently around the stone. Its warmth softened, as if responding. No one at the station asked why my uniform smelled like cave earth and cold fur. No one asked why my eyes kept drifting toward the tree line. People usually don't ask questions they're afraid to hear the answers to. But sometimes late at night, when the wind slides through the pines just right, I hear the knocking again. Not close, not far, present. And I remember the semicircle of watchers in the dark, the warmth of the stone, the hum of the chamber, the understanding that shifted something fundamental inside me. Some stories aren't meant to scare us. Some stories are meant to remind us we are not the first to walk these woods, and we won't be the last. The forest endures, the spirits endure, and I walk between them, not as a ranger, not as a witness, not as a victim, but as someone who finally understands that the deepest fear isn't what lives in the darkness, it's what the darkness has always known about us, and still watches, still waits, still whispers, even now. I didn't understand what silence meant until the night the pines stopped breathing. You spend enough years in the woods, and you start to think you can read the forest the way a doctor reads a pulse, steady, rhythmic, predictable in its own wild way. But the silence that night wasn't calm. It was expectant, like the trees themselves were holding something in, reluctant to let me hear it too soon. I remember pausing at the trailhead with my radio in hand, thumb hovering over the call button, unable to explain why the air felt suddenly heavier than it should have in mid-September. My name is Cole. I'm 37, and I've spent half my life walking the borders of fog-stained timber, posted deep in the northern ranges where the locals claim there were things they shouldn't. I used to laugh at that. I used to think that people just get strange when they live too far from town lights. But the longer I've been here, the more I've realized that isolation doesn't create superstition. It reveals a part of the world that most people never stay quiet long enough to hear. I work out of a small ranger station tucked beside a logging road that used to be busier 30 years ago. These days, it's just me and a handful of volunteers who come and go with the seasons. The mountains rise behind us in long, dark slopes like an animal sleeping under a blanket of trees. The old men of the nearby township call them the back ridges, like they're referring to something that belongs to them but bites when touched. When I arrived here, fresh from a search and rescue program that taught me more about the human body under stress than I ever wanted to know, I had confidence bordering on arrogance. I believed training and logic were enough to understand anything that happened in these woods. Missing hiker, panic, injury, or bad luck. Weird noises at night, wind, animals, or topography. Shadows where none should be, exhaustion, imagination, stress. For years, that explanation was enough. Then came the first night the knocking started. It was late, around 2 a.m., and I had been in my bunk half asleep when something tapped on the side of the station's metal siding. 3 knocks, slow, even, not like an animal brushing past, more like the patient, deliberate gesture of someone standing just out of sight and wanting me to know I was being acknowledged. I remember sitting up fast, heart thudding, and staring out into the dark through the tiny window beside the door, but there was nothing there. Just the faint outline of pines swaying gently, still breathing their usual rhythm. I chalked it up to a branch or shifting temperature. Rational explanations, the kind I lived on. But the next night, the knocks came again, this time from the opposite side of the station. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more, like a pattern, like a language I hadn't learned yet. By the 3rd night, I was leaving the lantern lit, pretending I wasn't doing it out of fear. I told myself it was for safety, but the truth was buried deeper. I didn't want the dark coming too close anymore. Still, I kept the knocks to myself. Rangers don't trade in superstition. We trade in evidence, footprints, weather maps, radio logs. There was nothing to report. It wasn't until my 2nd month that I finally told someone, an older local named Virgil who ran an unofficial guide service and had lived in these mountains longer than most of us had been alive. He had this habit of staring at the tree line as though it wasn't made of branches and needles, but faces. When I told him about the knocks, he didn't laugh, didn't tease, didn't try to explain it away. He just nodded once and said, "Let me guess, 3 of them? Slow like talking? I remember the way his voice dropped when he said that. Low, flat, certain. I asked him who it was. Some prankster? Kids? A poacher? Someone messing with the new ranger? Virgil shook his head. Not someone, he said. Something that walks the old claim roads. It follows the metal. Then he turned back to packing his truck with firewood like the conversation was over. Like he'd already said too much. That should have been enough to unsettle me, but something inside me resisted his meaning. My whole life had been built on the idea that fear comes from misunderstanding, not from truth. The moment you name something, the moment you categorize it, the fear should shrink. That's what I believed. But that belief started to fracture the night I found the footprints behind the station. They weren't boots, not paws. The shape was almost human, but too long in the stride, too heavy in the depth. I measured one with my hand pressed into the dirt, fingers stretched. It was bigger than my spread palm by several inches. And worse, there were only 2 prints, side by side, as if whatever left them had simply appeared there. No approach, no departure, just 2 impressions, pressed deep into the soil like the forest had been forced to hold something it didn't want to accommodate. The unease that had been whispering in the back of my mind finally took shape, and denial began to fray. I found myself checking the windows twice before turning off the lantern, listening for the knocks, counting the seconds between gusts of wind, and imagining shapes moving where there were none. My instincts started screaming at me in ways my training never taught me to interpret. But that was just the beginning. The first encounter I tell people about, the one that marked the start of these 4 stories locals still whisper, didn't happen at the station. It happened deeper in the woods, past the old copper mine nobody visits anymore. I had been sent out on a routine patrol after hikers reported strange animal sounds echoing through the ravine. They described them as howls at first, then later changed it to something closer to a voice. Long, drawn-out syllables that carried across the trees like speech shaped by the wrong kind of throat. It was a cold morning when I set out, the kind where the frost clings to your beard and your breath looks thicker than smoke. The trail was frozen hard, and every step cracked like breaking glass under my boots. My radio crackled in and out as I got farther from the station, but that wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the scent. The forest usually smells like something alive. Pine, earth, sap, wet stone. But halfway to the ravine, I caught a smell that didn't belong, like old metal left out in the rain too long. Rusty, acrid, almost like dried blood. It came in waves, drifting between the trees, disappearing whenever I tried to track it down. I felt foolish stopping every few steps to sniff the air like some anxious animal, but something had worked its way under my skin. It made the back of my neck feel exposed, like someone was running cold fingers just above the surface. The closer I got to the ravine, the more wrong the forest felt. Birds should have been making noise. Squirrels should have rustled through the branches. But there was nothing. Not even the creak of old trunks bending under frost. The silence from the trailhead had followed me here, thickening with each step. When I reached the ridge, I heard it for the first time. A sound low in the ravine. Not human, not animal. Something stretched between the two. It started as a hum, almost too faint to hear. Then it deepened, vibrating through the ground in a way that made my teeth ache. I froze. Not because of fear, at least not entirely, but because it felt like the sound was meant to stop me. Like the forest was holding its breath again, waiting to see what I would do. I leaned forward, listening. The hum shifted, lifted, formed something close to a word. I didn't recognize it, but my body did. My instincts recoiled hard, like something inside me understood before my mind could translate. A gust of cold air washed over the ridge then, carrying that rust metal scent again. And in that moment, for the first time in my years as a ranger, I realized something was watching me. Something that knew my presence. Something that knew my name. And as I stood there gripping the straps of my pack so tightly, my knuckles went white, I felt the first fracture in the confidence I had brought to these woods. It was small, almost invisible, but it was enough for fear to seep in, enough to make me wonder what else the pines remembered that they hadn't shown me yet. The feeling of being watched wasn't new to me. Any ranger who works alone long enough knows that sensation. The eyes you can't see, the presence that disappears whenever you turn too quickly. Usually, it's a deer holding still in the brush or a cat tracking you from a vantage point you'll never spot. But this was different. This presence didn't hide. It lingered. It observed. It waited for me to acknowledge it. The hum in the ravine dropped back into silence, leaving the air hollow and expectant. I should have radioed in. Protocol said that any unidentified sound matching potential distress had to be logged and reported. But the rules felt far away, irrelevant, like they belonged to the world behind me rather than the one I was standing in now. Something told me not to speak, not even to breathe loudly. I scanned the tree line. The pines leaned over the ravine, their trunks black and slick with frost, each needle catching the weak sunlight like tiny pieces of glass. The forest felt sharper, every detail clearer, too clear, as if the air itself was listening. Then I heard it again. Not a hum this time, not a call or a howl, a whisper. It came from below, soft, fragile, like someone exhaling a secret through cupped hands. I couldn't make out words if they were words at all, but the cadence crawled into my ears and settled behind my sternum. It didn't sound malicious. It sounded lonely, as if whatever was down there wasn't calling for me, but calling to me. Against every instinct I had, I stepped closer to the edge. The ravine fell away sharply, a tangle of broken shale and deadfall leading into a narrow trench carved by ancient water. Mist gathered near the bottom, swirling around the rocks like breath trapped beneath the earth. I searched for movement, for anything, an animal, a person, a shadow, but the ravine was empty. Yet the whisper continued. I crouched at the edge, one hand on the cold dirt, leaning forward just enough to see deeper into the mist. The sound rose, brushing against my ear like something warm and alive. My heart hammered once, hard enough to echo in my ribs. I jerked back in reflex, boots slipping on the frost. For a moment I thought I would tumble down the slope, but my hand shot out and grabbed a root jutting from the ground. My glove scraped, skin burning through the fabric. The whisper stopped instantly, not faded, stopped, like a mouth snapping shut. My breathing filled the sudden silence, too loud, too human. I forced myself to my feet, radio in hand, thumb trembling over the transmit button. But again, something inside me resisted. A heavy pressure gathered at the base of my skull, not painful, but insistent. A wordless warning to stay quiet, to keep this moment between me and the thing that had noticed me. I don't know how long I stood there before the forest shifted back into itself. A crow called somewhere behind me, breaking the paralysis. A breeze swept through the pines, carrying the familiar sense of sap and cold stone. I blinked, realization flooding me all at once. The metallic smell was gone. I made my way back to the station without remembering half the trail. My boots crunched through frost, my steps too fast for the terrain. Every few minutes I glanced back over my shoulder, certain I'd see something tall and dark following silently behind me. But the trail stayed empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen matched my pace just beyond sight. By the time I reached the station, my hands were stiff with cold and my lungs burned. I closed the door behind me harder than I intended and locked it, something I almost never did during the day. I set my pack down and listened. The knocks didn't come. The silence that had followed me up the trail lingered like a shadow. I made coffee I didn't want, sat at the small table with the mug between my palms, and watched the frost creep along the bottom of the window. Later that afternoon, Virgil showed up with a stack of winter prep supplies. He took one look at me and frowned beneath his sun-creased eyes. "You see something?" he asked. His voice wasn't casual. I didn't answer at first. I didn't know how. The things I'd experienced felt like fragments, sounds and scents and sensations that didn't form a coherent picture. But something in me needed to know what he knew. what he'd suspected long before I had arrived. I told him what I heard in the ravine. I didn't tell him about the whisper brushing my ear. Some things felt too strange to put into words without breaking the fragile, unspoken line between sanity and superstition. He listened without interrupting, eyes fixed on the far trees, jaw tight. When I finished, he exhaled slowly, breath clouding in the cold air. "That part of the valley isn't yours to patrol alone," he said. My stomach tightened. "Why? Because of a story? Some old legend?" He shook his head. "Because things that whisper down there don't stay down there. You hear them once and they know you. They'll follow your shadow until they're done trying to understand you." I stared at him, unsure whether anger or fear should take hold first. "What exactly is they?" He hesitated. That scared me more than if he'd answered immediately. "Men like Virgil don't hesitate unless the truth is worse than the fear of speaking it." "Spirits," he said at last. "But not the kind you pray to. The kind that remember what lived here before we carved roads through its ribs." I told him that wasn't an answer. He told me it wasn't meant to be. He left before sundown, giving me one last piece of advice. "If you hear knocking again, don't open the door. It won't be asking permission." That night, the knocks returned. 3 slow taps, on the window this time. Not the siding, the window. My breath caught in my throat and the lantern flickered as though something had passed between me and the flame. I sat on my bunk, muscles rigid, eyes fixed on the glass. The knocks came again, softer, almost exploring the surface rather than striking it. Something moved outside. A shadow shifting the wrong way, against the wind, not with it. I should have radioed it in. I should have photographed it, documented it, done anything except sit frozen in silence. But fear has a way of erasing training, stripping you back to instinct. And my instinct was telling me to be still, to breathe shallowly, to listen. A faint scrape trailed along the glass, like a fingertip tracing a line. Then another. My pulse quickened until I could hear it in my ears. Slowly, too slowly, I stood and reached for the lantern. The flame dimmed as if reacting to something outside. I lifted the lantern toward the window. The light reflected off the frost, casting my own blurred outline across the glass. But behind that reflection, something shifted. Not a face, not a body. Something tall. Too tall. A shape that ducked out of sight before I could process it. The knocks stopped, the scraping stopped, and the forest sank into silence again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat awake in the dim lantern glow, listening for any sign the thing had returned. Every time the wind moved through the pines, every time the station creaked, my muscles tightened. Sometime near dawn, as the first thin line of light touched the treetops, a single sound drifted through the air. A whisper. Just one. But it wasn't coming from the ravine this time. It was coming from the tree line behind the station. My name. It said my name. Not exactly. Not perfectly. But close enough that my blood turned to ice. That was the second encounter, and it wasn't the last. I told myself I misheard it, that the whisper drifting from the trees at dawn couldn't have formed my name. The mind is vulnerable in those border hours between night and morning, the hour when exhaustion bends your thoughts, when fear reaches through the cracks in your defenses and shapes the world into something hostile. That was the rational explanation. The one I clung to as I watched the sun smear faint pink along the ridge as the shadows retreated reluctantly from the station walls. But there was another explanation, the one I wasn't ready to face. The one that sat heavy in my chest like a buried warning. I didn't report what happened. I couldn't. How do you write something like that in an official log? Unknown entity called my name at sunrise. I could already hear the laughter from the regional office, the subtle questioning of my competence, the possibility of reassignment, or worse, mandatory leave for psychological evaluation. I'd seen good rangers sidelined over less, so I did what fear often forces us to do. I stayed silent, but silence has a way of becoming its own trap. 2 days passed with no knocks, no whispers, nothing unusual. The forest breathed normally again, alive with bird calls and shifting branches. The metallic smell never returned. The ravine felt distant, like a half-remembered dream. I started thinking maybe the mountain had been playing tricks on me, temperature distortions, echo patterns, fatigue. Then the third encounter happened. Unlike the knocking, it didn't wait for nightfall. And unlike the whisper in the ravine, it didn't hide behind distance. It came for me in the middle of the day. I had been assigned to check an old forestry road near the far side of the valley, a place where storms routinely knocked down trees and blocked access to the fire breaks. Winter was creeping closer, and everything needed to be cleared before snow turned the roads into impassable traps. The sky was the kind of blue that felt too pure for anything ominous, and a light wind carried the scent of pine resin and thawing soil. For the first time since the ravine incident, I felt almost normal. Tense, alert, but steady. I reached the downed tree around noon. It was massive, a 50-foot pine split at the base, bark stripped on one side as if something had struck it from below. The break wasn't natural. Trees don't fall like that. They shear from wind or rot or lightning, not from force pushing upward. But I didn't know that yet. I radioed in the location, grabbed my axe, and began clearing the smaller branches to make space for a chainsaw crew. The forest was quiet, but not unnaturally so. Birds chirped. Squirrels chattered overhead. Normal sounds. Normal movement. Until it wasn't. The first sign came as a tremor beneath my boots, subtle, rhythmic, like something shifting its weight underground. I paused, axe raised mid-swing, listening. The tremor came again, then again. Not like an earthquake, those roll and pulse. This was deliberate, steady, heavy. I stepped back from the downed tree. The forest fell utterly silent. Every bird, every insect, every breath of wind. Silence so complete it pressed against my eardrums. A slow chill crept over my arms, raising goosebumps beneath my sleeves. The air felt colder by degrees, like someone had opened a door to winter right beside me. I took a step back, then another, eyes scanning the trees. That was when I saw the movement. Not ahead of me. Beside me. The shadow stretched across the ground, long and thin, cast by something standing behind a cluster of pines. It shifted slightly as if adjusting its stance. For a split second, I thought it might be a moose, tall, broad, capable of moving silently when it wanted to. But the shape was wrong, too tall. The shadow stretched nearly twice my height, legs too long, torso too narrow. And the head was tilted, almost curious. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sand. Hello? The word came out small, invisible in the frozen air. The shadow didn't move. I edged to the right, trying to get an angle through the trees, palms sweating against the axe handle. But as I shifted, the shadow shifted too, sliding out of view with unnatural grace, as though whoever cast it wasn't walking, but gliding one fraction of a second ahead of my line of sight. I felt it then. The watching. The same presence from the ravine. Closer now. Standing just inside the perimeter of the clearing, observing me with a patience that felt almost intelligent. I forced myself to breathe slow, deep breaths. Fear makes noise. Panic makes mistakes. The forest felt like it was waiting to hear which choice I'd make. I took a careful step back toward the road. A twig snapped, not under my boot, behind me. I spun, axe raised. Nothing. Only empty trees swaying slightly as though disturbed a moment earlier. I backed up again, heartbeat thudding painfully against my ribs, then the scent hit me. That same metallic tang from the ravine. Rust and stone, something old and cold. It seeped into the clearing like invisible smoke, coiling through the branches and wrapping around me. The smell grew heavier, thicker, as if the forest itself was exhaling it. The tremor beneath my boots returned, stronger this time. The ground trembled in a slow, deliberate thump, 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 like footsteps approaching from beneath the soil. My legs locked. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but something deeper, older, held me rooted in place. A primal part of me understood that whatever was moving toward me didn't chase, it lured. The shadow reappeared at the edge of the clearing, this time taller, closer. Its outline clearer, not a person, not an animal, but something caught between the two. Shoulders hunched, limbs long enough to touch the ground, head tilted at an angle that suggested curiosity or confusion or hunger. It began to straighten, slowly, silently. Too tall. Far too tall. The breath left my lungs in one hard exhale. I stumbled back without meaning to, boot catching on a root. The axe slipped from my hand. It hit the ground with a dull thud that echoed far louder than it should have in the frozen silence. The shadow froze. Then, a sound, a rasping inhale, as if something enormous had just drawn its first breath near me. I scrambled backward, fumbling for the axe, but my hands shook too badly to close around the handle. The shadow shifted again, leaning toward me. Not quickly, not aggressively, just leaning, observing, as though trying to understand my shape the way I was trying to understand its. The tremor pulsed again. This time the ground cracked. Not a big crack, just a thin fracture running from the base of the downed tree to the shadow's feet, like the earth itself was reacting to its presence. That broke my paralysis. I lunged for the axe, grabbed it, and ran. Branches whipped my face. Frost slicked the ground. I slipped twice, caught myself both times, breath tearing through my throat. I didn't look back. Looking back felt like an invitation. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were trembling so violently I could barely fit the key into the ignition. I slammed the door shut and locked it, even though it felt like locking a thin sheet of metal against a rising tide. The engine roared to life, tires skidding on the frost as I tore down the road. Only when I hit the main highway did I finally check the rearview mirror. Nothing followed. But the scent, that rust metal smell, clung to my clothes until midnight. I showered twice. It didn't wash off. By the next morning, it was gone. But something inside me wasn't. Something had shifted. A boundary I didn't know existed had been crossed, and the forest felt different now. Like it was no longer a place I worked, but a place watching me back. And deep down, beneath every rational thought I tried to cling to, a realization grew slowly, like frost spreading across glass. Whatever was in these woods wasn't just observing. It was learning me. The next week felt like living with a shadow pressed against the inside of my skull. Even when the forest sounded normal, even when the patrol route stayed quiet, even when the ravines lay still beneath the morning mist, I felt it, an awareness that clung to me like a scent I couldn't wash off. I went through every motion of the job the same way I always did, but the woods had changed, or maybe I had. I caught myself hesitating before stepping between two close-standing trees, as if something might be waiting on the other side. I found excuses to stay near the station after dark. I slept with the lantern lit, pretending the flame kept my thoughts from unraveling. But the biggest change was harder to admit. I began avoiding my own reflection. I'd catch glimpses of myself in the station window or in the truck's rearview mirror, and for a second, just a short, breathless second, I'd swear the reflection wasn't holding still, like it was a half-beat behind me, a shadow learning the rhythm of my movements. I tried to rationalize it. Exhaustion, stress, a mind worn thin by too many nights without real sleep. But deep down, I knew something else had taken root, something that didn't follow rules I understood. And the fourth encounter proved I wasn't imagining it. It started with a radio call from dispatch. Hikers had gone missing near the old mining caves on the eastern ridge, a father and his teenage son. No signs of them at the trailhead, no answer to repeated calls. Last known location placed them near a slope that had a history of minor landslides and unstable ground. I geared up fast. Search and rescue was second nature to me, and fear, real fear, tends to take a step back when you're responsible for someone else's life. The forest was cold that morning, sharp with the promise of early snow. Frost clung to every branch, turning them into silver daggers pointing toward a sky too pale to feel warm. The trail to the mines wound through a thick cluster of pines, their trunks dark and narrow, the canopy above blotting out most of the daylight. It was an old route, barely maintained, lined with rusted equipment and collapsed beams swallowed by moss. Locals said the caves were haunted by the spirits of miners who had drilled too deep into the mountain's bones. I never believed that. Not back then, not until that day. I found the first sign of the hikers a mile in, an abandoned backpack lying beside the trail. Still zipped. No signs of struggle. Inside were snacks, a headlamp, a folded map. The headlamp was warm when I touched it, recently used. A few yards ahead, the frost on the ground was disturbed. Not footprints, not exactly. Something had passed through, but the marks were too long, too smooth, like something heavy had dragged itself silently over the earth. That rust metal scent, faint but undeniable, drifted through the trees. My stomach clenched. I called out the hikers' names, waiting for any reply. Only the echo answered, bouncing strangely off the trunks as though the sound traveled through something hollow. I followed the disturbed frost toward the mouth of the mining cave. The entrance yawned open like a wound torn into the side of the mountain. Wooden supports rotting and buckling inward, icicles hanging like teeth. The air flowing from within was colder than the wind outside, unnaturally so, carrying a dampness that clung to my face like breath. I hesitated at the threshold. Every instinct I had screamed at me not to go inside. That whatever I'd felt in the ravine, whatever had watched me near the fallen tree, whatever had whispered my name in the dawn, this place was connected to it. Not just connected, born from it, but there were two missing people somewhere in the dark. Fear becomes a luxury when someone else needs you. I switched on my flashlight and stepped into the cave. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating old mining rails half buried under rock. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, each drop echoing like a distant clock tick. The tunnel smelled of damp stone, old wood, and something else, something metallic and sharp beneath the surface. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the air became. It pressed against my chest, slowing my breathing, thickening the shadows at the edges of the light. The tunnel forked in two. The frost trail led left. I followed it. A sound reached me after a few minutes. Breathing. But not human breathing. Too slow, too deep, like air being pulled through a long, hollow chamber. My flashlight flickered once, then again, and then the whisper came, not ahead of me, behind me, close, so close it brushed the back of my neck. I spun, light trembling across the tunnel walls. No one there, nothing moving, but the frost at my feet shifted subtly, like something invisible had passed through it a moment earlier. I forced myself to keep going. Step by step, breath by breath. The trail widened into a chamber. My beam caught something metallic on the ground, a hiking pole, battered, bent inward, not outward, as though something had grabbed it with force. My voice cracked as I called out again, "Hello? Can you hear me?" A sound answered, not a voice, a knock. 3 slow strikes against stone, deliberate, measured, close enough that dust drifted from the ceiling. My chest tightened. The knocks echoed the same pattern I'd heard at the station, the same rhythm that had followed me for weeks. I edged toward the sound. The chamber narrowed into another tunnel, and that was where I saw the second backpack. This one ripped open, fabric torn like paper. The frost surrounding it was melted in places, forming long streaks where the ground looked almost scorched. Footprints, real footprints this time, led deeper in. The father's boots, the son's smaller pair beside them. They looked hurried, uneven, as if the two had been running. But the tracks ended abruptly, just a few feet inside the tunnel. Not turned around, not veering off, just ending. As though the earth had swallowed them whole. I crouched, breath shaking, studying the spot. The ground wasn't disturbed. The frost wasn't broken. It was like the footprints had been erased mid-step. The chill crawling off my spine turned to a spike. Then, from deep within the tunnel, I heard a sound I will never forget. A voice, human, weak, whispering my name. Not mispronounced this time. Perfect. I lunged toward the sound, flashlight beam bouncing wildly across rock. The name came again, whisper thin, desperate, yet it echoed wrong, splitting into multiple layers that didn't match. Like several mouths whispering at once. The tunnel sloped downward, narrowing until the walls pressed close to my shoulders. Water pooled underfoot, numbing my ankles. The air grew colder still, too cold, as though I had stepped out of time into a place light was not meant to reach. My flashlight dimmed again. Then something moved at the edge of the darkness, not walked, not stepped, glided. A tall shape, barely illuminated, ducked away from the beam before I could focus on it. My breath caught and the light flickered violently as if reacting to its presence. The whisper came again, this time from the right tunnel wall. My name. Soft, almost tender. I slammed the flashlight against my palm. It steadied just long enough to illuminate the wall, and I saw it. A handprint. Enormous. Pressed deep into the stone as though the rock had briefly softened beneath unimaginable weight. The edges of the print glistened with frost. That was the moment my fear hit its breaking point. Not panic, not the wild urge to flee, but a cold, crushing certainty that whatever lived in this mountain wasn't a lost spirit or an animal or a hallucination born from the dark. It was something old, something that remembered, something that listened, something that had been learning me. The flashlight gave one final sputter, then it died. Darkness swallowed me whole, and in the vast, suffocating black, a new sound rose. Breathing, not mine. Close enough that I felt the air stir against my cheek. I stumbled backward, hands scraping the cave wall, lungs burning. A cold weight pressed against the back of my shoulder. Not grabbing, not striking, just touching, as though trying to understand the shape of me. I broke. I bolted. Blind. Scrambling through water and stone, slamming shoulders against rock, tearing skin on jagged edges. The whisper chased me through the tunnel, my name stretching unnaturally, echoing in a chorus of mismatched tones. The breathing grew louder, closer. The air warped with each exhale that wasn't mine. I hit the main tunnel without knowing how and sprinted toward the faint gray glow of daylight. My boots skidded, my hands scraped, my chest heaved, and then light. I burst out into the open air, falling to my knees in the frost and sucking down the cold morning like it was life. The forest was silent. Not watching, not whispering, just silent. And for the first time, I understood that silence wasn't safety. It was warning. The father and son were never found, only their backpacks, and the memory of something cold and patient trailing my shadow back to the station. I never told the department what I saw in the cave, not fully. I reported the missing hikers, the signs of an unstable tunnel, the damaged equipment, the dangerous conditions. But the truth, the breathing, the whispering, the shape that moved just beyond the reach of my light, I kept buried. Not because I wanted to protect my job, though that was part of it. Not because I feared people would call me unstable. I stayed silent because something deeper than reputation was at stake. The thing in the cave had followed me out. It didn't show itself in the open. It didn't knock the next night or whisper again from the tree line, but I felt it, woven into the stillness between each breath, pacing behind the walls of the station like a shadow learning the limits of its enclosure. The lantern flame would bend when I walked past it, tugged by an unseen current. Frost would bloom inside the window glass before dawn, forming long streaks that looked like fingers dragged from the inside out. And that metallic scent, the rusted tang of the cave, would drift through the station in thin, intermittent waves, fading before I could track its source. I tried to convince myself it was in my head. But fear doesn't disappear when you tell it to. Fear lingers. Fear grows roots. And every night, as I lay awake in the dim glow of the lantern, I felt those roots twisting deeper into me, wrapping around the certainty I had once carried through these woods. My confidence, my rationality, my training, those things felt like brittle, sun-bleached leaves crumbling under something I couldn't see. I reached the point where I avoided the mirror entirely. Not because I feared seeing something behind me, because I feared I might not recognize the expression staring back. The breaking point came 3 nights after the cave incident. The station had settled into that unnatural stillness again, the kind that wasn't silence but pressure, an invisible weight leaning against the windows, testing their strength. My breath came shallow, my skin prickling each time the wind slowed or a branch stopped swaying too abruptly. I couldn't shake the sense that the forest had shifted around me, rearranging itself while I wasn't looking. Around midnight, the radio crackled. No voice, just a faint hum, the same hum from the ravine. I sat up slowly, the hair on my arms lifting. The hum vibrated through the radio casing, through the table, through the floorboards under my socks. My heartbeat matched its rhythm. Then the hum shifted, lifted, stretched into that almost word I had heard days earlier. I stood, gripping the edge of the table until my fingers ached. The hum stopped, and something knocked. Once, on the door. Not 3 knocks, not the rhythm I had grown used to dreading. One single heavy strike, like a heartbeat dropped into the wood. I didn't move. My breath fogged in the air. The temperature inside the station dipped sharply, frost climbing the window from the bottom up like a tide coming in. Another knock. 1. Slow. Steady. Steady. Too heavy for a human hand. I stepped back, pulse thundering. Some part of me, the rational part, the one trained to handle emergencies, urged me to grab my sidearm, to call dispatch, to identify the threat and confront it. But the deeper part of me, the instinct carved into my bones long before I became a ranger, stayed rigid with understanding. Opening that door wasn't survival, it was invitation. The knocking stopped, but something else replaced it. Breathing. Slow, deep inhalations, right outside the door. I backed away until my spine touched the far wall. The lantern flame guttered as if pulled by that breath, shrinking to a trembling pin of light. The breathing paused. Then a whisper seeped between the doorframe and the air. Not my name this time. A word I didn't know. A word spoken in a voice layered with too many tones to belong to any single creature. I felt it settle under my skin like cold water. The lantern extinguished. Darkness swallowed the station. I didn't move. Couldn't. The breathing filled the room now. Not just the doorway. Every corner, every shadow. It felt like the walls themselves were inhaling and exhaling around me. My hand found the edge of the bunk. I dropped to my knees, not in prayer, but in something far less noble, pure collapse. I squeezed my eyes shut like darkness could protect me from darkness. The breathing grew louder, closer. A cold draft circled my neck, and then silence. Utter, absolute silence. The kind that didn't feel like safety. The kind that felt like waiting. Minutes passed, or hours. Time lost meaning. I stayed frozen on the floor until a thin gray line of dawn crept under the blinds. When the light finally reached my hand, warming my knuckles, the station looked normal again. No frost on the windows, no scent in the air, no sound but the soft ticking of the heater turning on. I survived the night. But something had changed. The forest no longer felt like a place. It felt like an intelligence. And it had decided I belonged to it now. I spent the next day walking the perimeter of the station, looking for footprints, broken branches, anything that could anchor the night to something real. But the ground was undisturbed. The trees stood tall and indifferent. Even the air smelled normal again. That frightened me most of all, because whatever had been there hadn't left tracks. It hadn't walked. It hadn't used the world the way we understood it. By late afternoon, I found myself driving toward town, unable to stay another night alone. Not because of weakness, but because something inside me whispered a truth I had ignored for too long. I wasn't safe here anymore. Not from the forest, not from myself, not from the thing that watched from behind the pines. I reached Virgil's place as the sun dipped behind the ridges, turning the tree line into a jagged black horizon. He opened the door before I knocked, as if he'd been expecting me. One look at my face and he stepped back, letting me in without a word. I told him everything, every whisper, every shadow, every breath in the dark. He listened without flinching, without skepticism, without the hollow comfort of rational explanations. When I finished, his hands trembled slightly as he poured hot water into a mug. "You stayed too long," he said quietly. "You heard too much." I stared at him. "What is it?" He hesitated, the same kind of hesitation he'd shown before, but this time he didn't withhold the truth. "Spirits of the pines," he said, "older than the mines, older than the towns, older than any name we've tried to give them. They don't haunt, they learn, they listen, and when someone wanders too close to where the mountain keeps its secrets, they pay attention." I swallowed hard. "Why me?" "Because you listened back." The room felt smaller suddenly, every shadow reaching for me. "So what happens now?" I asked. Virgil met my eyes with a heaviness I'd never seen in him before. "You leave," he said. "You don't go back to that station. You don't answer when the forest calls, and whatever you hear in the wind or the dark, ignore it. And if it follows, his silence was the answer. I left before nightfall. I drove away from the station, away from the pines, away from the cave that breathed in the dark. But as the road curved through the foothills and the forest thinned, something in me tightened. Not fear, not quite, something colder. I realized then that the forest wasn't behind me. Not really. It was inside me now. Because the truth about fear, the truth I had learned too late, is that it doesn't cling to the place where you felt it. It clings to the version of yourself who survived it. And that version of me, he never truly left the mountain. The forest keeps its secrets, but it also keeps its witnesses. And some nights when the wind breaks just right, I swear I hear it again. The soft hum rising from the deepest parts of myself, shaping a word I still don't understand. A word spoken by a mountain that never forgets the ones who listened. A word that reminds me I am no longer the protector of these woods. I am the warning.